Hey everyone, this is Dave from the Adobe Character Animator team, and in general, Character Animator has a lot of characters that you can use for your projects, whether that's ones from the home screen, ones you download online, or even ones you customize using the Puppet Maker tool. But there's a lot of you out there who want to make your own puppets from scratch, right? We all have our unique drawing styles, and wouldn't it be nice if we see our characters come to life? And so if you fall into that camp, this is the video for you. This is an introduction to all things rigging. We're going to start with the artwork creation and talk about how we're going to organize everything into groups and layers and certain naming conventions that Character Animator is going to understand how to animate it later. Then we'll jump into Character Animator, specifically in rig mode, and show you how to add things like handles and tags and behaviors to have your puppet start to come to life. And finally, we're going to end with a walkthrough of a free example download project of 15 different common body types and features in Character Animator. That's everything from very simple straight-on characters to characters with head and body turns to full body tracking. So if you've ever wanted to make your own character from scratch, let's get started. All right, so I'm ready to start creating my first character from scratch, and the first question I have to ask myself is, where do I want to create this character? Because you don't actually create the artwork in Character Animator itself. You're actually using programs like Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator to create PSD or AI files. These are layered files that then Character Animator will be able to interpret where all the different parts are and how it animates and all of that. Now, you're not limited to Photoshop or Illustrator. For example, a lot of times I use Adobe Fresco on my iPad Pro. I draw the character on that, and then I bring it into Photoshop as a PSD file. You can export it out as a PSD, and that works well also. One of the most common questions we get is people asking, well, what program should I use? Is there a benefit to using Illustrator over Photoshop or vice versa? And my general answer is go with whatever you feel most comfortable and familiar with. Honestly, statistics show that it's about half and half. It's kind of a swap between the two. So there's no, majority of people using one program or the other. For me, when I'm creating my own characters, these are two characters that I've created. Really, for me, it goes with the style of character that I'm going for. So when I'm doing a more hyper detailed character like this robot Evan Flamethrower over here with these, laser effects and fire and this metal texture and all of that, I'm going to tend to do that in Photoshop. It just gives me more ability to do more of that hand-drawn, detailed look. Whereas when I'm going for kind of a more clean, cel-shaded type character, like Lyndon over here, this guitar-playing character, and I've got the strokes around the edges and all of that stuff, and kind of more flat shapes, more what I would expect from a traditional cartoon, then I'm going to go with Illustrator. But that's just my personal preference. You do what you feel most comfortable with, and you're going to end up fine. So for the purposes of today's tutorial, I'm going to stick to Adobe Illustrator. It's just a little bit easier for me to create the shapes simply that I want to quickly and put everything together that way. But 99% of what I'm going to be saying today translates directly to Photoshop as well. So you can follow along with either program. And if there are particular aspects of the process where Photoshop greatly differs from Illustrator, I'm going to call them out so you know what's going on. All right, so I'm here on the Adobe Illustrator home screen, and I'm going to go ahead and go to New File in the upper left corner, and that's going to bring up this dialog allowing me to set up my document however I want. So typically, I'm going to set my document to something like 1500 by 1500 pixels. This is going to give me enough space to create a nice big character that's going to fit well in a typical HD setup, let's say a 1920 by 1080 video, something like that. And that allows me to rescale and move my character around without, getting pixelated or blurry or anything like that. The other thing I note is make sure your color mode is set to RGB color instead of CMYK color. That's just going to work a little bit better for the screen-based stuff that we're doing here. And here's what my settings would look like in Photoshop. So it's also 1500 by 1500 pixels. I've got a resolution of 72 pixels per inch. I don't need to go above that for screen-based stuff. So if this is 150 or 300, go ahead and turn that down to 72. I've also got RGB color. And you probably want your background contents to be transparent, because if you can choose white or black or something else, it's actually going to show up as a layer that Character Animator is going to think is included as part of your character, and you probably don't want that, so go ahead and select transparent. All right, so heading back to Illustrator, I'm happy with my settings. I'm gonna go ahead and click Create. Now, depending on your version of Illustrator or how you've set things up, your screen might look a little bit different from mine. I'm going with the default up here, workspace. I'm just going with Essentials, and that is going to allow me to just get the basics. Really, all I care about, though, is this Layers panel over here and these tools on the left. Those are the main things that I'll be using today. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go up here to my Layers tab. I'm going to double click on the layer 1 that's already been created, and I'm going to call this plus puppet. So why am I doing this? Well, this is going to be my main container that I'm going to put everything else inside. So plus puppet, plus is a secret code that we use for Character Animator to make a group or layer independent when it's imported. We'll talk about that a little later. Don't worry about that now. And then puppet is just a generic term we're using. This could be anything. This could be plus Billy or plus Sally or whatever name you want for your character. But a more general term that you can use for this is just plus puppet. Then I'm going to go down here and create 2 more layers. Click this twice, and I'm going to rename these to head and body, like that. And then I'm going to drag both of these into my plus puppet layer right here. And this is the typical setup for 99% of the puppets that you will ever make in Character Animator. Plus puppet with head and body inside. Now, if you're in Photoshop, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Actually, what we're going to do is you can't really drag a layer into another layer here in Photoshop. That's not possible. Instead, what I'm going to do is click on this little add group, create new group. I'm going to click that 3 times. And then I'm going to double click and rename this plus puppet, and this one head, and this one body. So, and then I can shift select and drag these into my puppet. So I have the same structure as Illustrator. So this is one major difference between the 2 applications, the way that we're going to set up these collections or these groups. In Photoshop, you're going to want to create the actual groups themselves. And in Illustrator, you're just going to want to drag layers into other layers. You can do grouping in Illustrator, but I found it's a little bit more confining in what you can do and how you can move things around. And so for beginners, I think it's a little bit easier to do it the way that I was showing earlier. But that is one difference between the 2 applications. So if you're wondering like how you're creating a group in one or the other, just remember in Photoshop, it's going to be this little folder icon, and in Illustrator, it's going to be dragging layers into other layers. Okay, so now that the basic structure is out of the way, I'm ready to start creating my actual character artwork. This is not going to be Nickelodeon or Disney level of animation. We're just going to be using really simple shapes to really quickly make things and get the point across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and create one more new layer, and I'm going to drag this inside my head. So now I've got, let me drag this out a little bit so I can see a little bit more. So layer 4 right now is inside my head. It was previously outside of it, and I just dragged it into the head here. And now I'm going to go over here to this shape tool over here. Right now it's the rectangle tool by default. I'm going to go ahead and click and hold on it and select the ellipse tool instead, so I get a more rounded head shape. And then what I'm going to do is go over here to the top of my canvas. I'm just going to click and drag and make a basic head that takes out maybe like 1/4 or 1/5 of the screen like that. So there we go. Now I've got a basic circle shape. But I'm going to probably want to add some color to this. So I'm going to go down here to my color, my fill, and my stroke color over here. I'm going to double click on the fill layer and bring up this color picker. And I can make this whatever color I want. So let's do like a blue color, something like that, maybe a deeper blue, and click OK. And there we go. I also have a stroke. If I select the stroke instead and double click on this, I can select a color for that as well. So I could do like go to black here, click OK, and then go over to my properties and change the stroke to be a little bit bigger, something like, 12 points or something like that. I don't need this color thing window here, so I'm going to click that to get rid of it. And that looks pretty good. Now to manipulate this, I'm going to want to use my selection tool here, this top one, this little arrow at the top. And I'm just going to reposition this and make sure it's in the right spot. If I wanted to make it bigger or smaller, I can of course drag the corners and make it look exactly like I want. Well, a floating head isn't that interesting, so I'm going to go back to my layers over here, and let's give it something inside the body. So I'm going to go ahead and click this new layer yet again. I'm going to drag this into the body, and now I'm going to make a rectangle. So I'm going to click on the shape again, go to my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to click and drag and make a rectangle for the basic torso for our character like that. And again, I can select it and manipulate it and move it if I want my character to be taller, smaller, all of that. And I do want a little bit of overlap with the head and the body like this. Of course, I could move this down and also, make a neck if I wanted to, something along those lines. You have a little bit of flexibility, but basically you want these two to be connected in some way. So they're all kind of moving together as one piece of artwork. And now let's finish out the rest of my character's skeleton with some basic limbs. So I'm going to go ahead and click the plus, add a new layer here again. And inside the body group, I'm going to go ahead and add an arm. And I'm going to kind of click and drag a really simple rectangle like this. And if I wanted that to be a little bit more rounded, I could actually go up here to the selection tool, select it, and these little circles that appear, I can click and drag that to make it a nice round arm piece and put it right there. So now that I've got one arm, I probably want my other arm to look the exact same, and be the same length. So I'm going to take this, go to Edit, Copy. So I selected my layer here. I went to Edit, Copy. I'm going to create a new layer. So this arm is going to be pasted onto a completely new, fresh layer, and then go to Edit, Paste. And now it's going to show up in its own layer here, and we're going to move that to the other side like that. Okay, a few extra things I want to do with the arms. Number one, the character right here is in what we would call a T pose. If you've ever seen in video games or 3D work, a lot of times characters will be set in this kind of T basic pose. But for Character Animator, we found that you get the most flexibility with arm movements if you have your character in what we call an A pose. So what I'm actually going to do is select one of these, and I can, on the corner here, if my cursor goes by the corner, I can get this little rotation icon. And then I'm just going to click and drag until I get about a 45-degree angle like that. You can also hold down the Shift key while you do this to snap to 45-degree angles. And then I'm just going to move this and drag it over so it overlaps with the character like that. Let's do the same for the other arm. I'm going to find it. I'm going to hold down Shift while I drag to get a 45-degree angle like that. And I'm going to move this over so it overlaps with the character. Again, you want your artwork to show up over top of the other artwork. You want it to be able to intersect and connect. You don't want your arms out like this where they're disconnected. Then it's not going to work as well. But you do have the option of, do you want your arms in front of your torso or behind? So here, in the way I have it set up right now, these arms are in front of the torso. And so the shoulders where they connect are going to show up in front of the torso as well. But if I wanted to take this torso and actually drag it above the arms like this, now the arms are going to appear behind, and it is going to hide the arms a little bit behind the torso. So it's a artistic decision which you want. Either works fine. There are limitations though. If I do it like this with the arms behind, then later when my character moves their arms, they're not going to show up in front of the torso. So if I wanted my character like rubbing their tummy, for example, I'm not going to be able to do that because the arm is actually going to appear behind the torso instead as it drags in front. So think about what's going to work best for your character, and you can experiment and play around with it. I'm going to leave mine on the front because right now I think it's going to show the arm movement a little bit easier for the purposes of this tutorial. But you'll notice that different puppets are set up in different ways. So experiment and see what works best for you. Now I'm going to go ahead and rename each of these layers. So I'm going to go to this layer 7 that I've created, which is on the left side of my screen, but actually is my character's right side, right? So if the character was looking at me, I know that this is actually his or her right arm. So I'm going to go ahead and double click and call this plus right arm. We'll talk about the pluses in a little bit. Don't worry about it too much now. And then again with the left arm, I'll double click and type in plus left arm like that. All right, let's finish things off with the legs. So I'm going to go ahead and add one more new layer here, and I'm going to use the rectangle yet again and drag right around here where a leg might be, something like that. And I'm also going to do the roundness thing to it like that. But I also might want a little foot coming out of here as well. And so with this layer still selected, I'm going to go ahead and add another rectangle down at the bottom like this, and that's going to be this character's foot. So in Illustrator, notice that because I did this both on the same layer, there's two parts here. There's the bottom part and the main leg part. In Photoshop, you would want this to be a group, a little folder icon, and put both of these parts inside the same group. So since I want my other leg to most likely be the exact same length and type as this one, I'm going to make sure my selection tool is selected up here. I'm going to click and drag so I select both parts here, and then I'll go to Edit Copy to copy those, make a new layer, and let's paste, edit, paste to bring it over. Now I want my character to kind of be a straight front view. So you could totally have the legs like this, but I actually want mine to look like it's going the other way. So you have a few options here. I could click and drag on the side here to make it reflect over and go like that. Or even easier, I can go up to Object, Transform, Reflect, and it's automatically with vertical reflection going to do like that. And then I can just use the arrow keys, hold down Shift while clicking the arrow keys to make it a little bit longer, make bigger jumps. And then when I want to fine tune it, just press the arrow keys a few times to make sure it's all lined up. And there we go. Now I've got a basic outline of a character. Now I don't have to name all these different parts, but I'm going to just because I find it a little bit helpful to know what I'm dealing with when I'm in Character Animator rig mode. So this leg right here, this looks like it was the character's right leg. So I'm going to double click and call this right leg. This next one is the left leg. So let's double click and call this left leg. And then the background here, I'm just going to call this BG for background. You don't want to call this head because then it can get mistagged as a second head. And then Character Animator thinks your character has two heads, and that's going to lead to a lot of problems. So the only thing in this whole setup that you have to name exactly correctly is this one right here, head, H-E-A-D. As long as it's named that's the information Character Animator needs to know to move with your own head movements in the webcam. Oh yeah, and I forgot about the torso down here, so I'm just going to double click this and call this torso. So my final grouping should look like this. I've got a main group called puppet here, and inside that, I've got my head and body. The head is just this circle for now, and the body should have a bunch of different things inside of it, but mainly the main things I want are plus right arm, plus left arm, and then these legs and torso. Again, these don't have to be named exactly this. This could be called plus tentacle or left claw or whatever if you're doing a robot character, a monster character, or something like that. The names are not important here, but we do recommend the pluses as I've put right here. All right, with that, the basic setup is done. So I'm going to go ahead and save this character by going to File, Save. And I'm going to save it into place and name it something that I can easily find. So I'm just going to call this guy blueguy.ai. He's saved on my desktop, and go ahead and click Save. And I want to make sure, by the way, he is an AI file. That brings up these options. All of that looks good. That's fine. Click OK. Okay, so for the time being, I am done with Adobe Illustrator. And now I'm going to go ahead and open up Character Animator. Okay, so I've opened up Character Animator, and an important distinction to make here is that Character Animator actually has two modes. We call it Starter Mode and Pro Mode. And by default, if this is your first time using Character Animator, you're going to be funneled into Starter Mode. And Starter Mode is great for getting started with Character Animator. You just select a character down here, you record your voice and head movements, you add a few triggers and emotions, and you've got an easy video. But if you want to do anything deeper or more complicated than that, including rigging your own custom character, all of that happens inside Pro Mode. So the best way to move between these different modes is up here, this little workspace icon. It should say Starter by default. And if I click on this, I get the option to stay in Starter Mode or use Pro Mode. So because I want to rig my own custom character, I want to go to Pro Mode for this. So I'm going to click Use Pro. And that has taken me to the Pro homepage here, and I can make sure that I'm there because it says Pro up here in the upper right-hand corner. All right, so we want to start with a blank, new, fresh project. So I'm going to go over here to New Project and click on that. And again, I can save this and call it whatever I want. I'm just going to call this Rig Example and go ahead and click Save. And now I've got a blank project, and it's completely open and ready for me to start bringing my character in. Hopefully you see your face up here and this audio meter moving. If you don't, refer to the Intro to Character Animator video, which will go through all the setup to fix that stuff if you need it. So now let's import in the Illustrator file that we created and see what happens. So I'm gonna go ahead over here, and you can do one of two things. You can either double click in the blank space in the project panel over here. So double clicking in here is gonna bring up your file browser, or you can go to File and Import. So on my desktop, I see blueguy.ai right here, and I'm gonna go ahead and import that. And what that does is import my puppet as an asset over here. I could do this as many times as I want, right? I can add multiple characters, backgrounds, audio files, whatever I want, and it's going to show up here. Just like in Premiere Pro or After Effects, if you're familiar with those programs, my project panel is kind of where all my assets are that I'm going to use in Character Animator. But a puppet by itself isn't going to really do anything. We need to add it into a scene to have it actually be able to move around. So the way I do that is I select my puppet. Puppet's your actor or actress, and your scene is the stage that they're actually set on. So with my puppet selected, I'm going to click this little clapboard icon down here, add to new scene, and there you go. And now my guy is showing up here and rotating with my head movement. Now, normally we don't float in the air like this and pivot from our neck, so I need to rig a few things differently, but overall I can tell that something is at least working here, right? Something is started. So now I need to jump into rig mode, and that's where I'm going to add certain functionality to this character to make it animate in the way that I want. So the way I do that is I'm going to double click on my puppet over here, Blue Guy. And doing that switches me over to rig mode. So I can switch between these different modes by going up here, clicking record, or clicking rig, or I can double click on a scene to take me to record mode, or double click on a puppet to take me into that puppet's rig mode. All right, so let's work on fixing that floating problem first. We gotta basically pin this guy's feet down to the ground. And the way we wanna do that is I'm gonna select my body group here. I don't wanna select the legs, I wanna select the body group. And then I'm going to go down here to the tools down below here. And there's this one called the pin tool. It looks like a little thumbtack, a little push pin. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to add one for each foot. So I'm going to put a little pin there and a little pin here. What is this doing exactly? Well, it's creating a handle, which are these little invisible data points that you can add to a character. And you see that it's being tagged over here as fixed, saying, I want this to stay fixed to the ground. So what I just did, another way to do this, just so you understand the rigging process a little bit better, is I could take just a blank handle tool over here, click it here, and tag it as fixed. It's the exact same thing that I just did. The push pin is just a little shortcut to be able to do that because it is a pretty common thing that you add into characters. So either way works. I'm just going to do this again, a blank handle, and tag it as fixed. You could have as many tags as you want for a individual. Look, and I got an error because I'm doing something that isn't possible here, but you can see that you can tag this as many tags as you want. Typically, you're probably going to have one, maybe two tags. It's rare that you get, more than that, but right now I want to untag all of these, and I can do that by clicking them here or clicking the little X that appears next to them. And there we go. Okay, so I've got two fixed handles down here. Let's see what that looks like with just that in record mode. Okay, so that solved one problem. It looks like the feet are tagged to the ground, but now my arms are flying off, and that's not looking too good. Also, my character is not really fitting in the scene as well as I want, so I can adjust that as well. If I single click my scene here to select it, notice over here on the right-hand side, I get things like frame rate, width, and height. So if I wanted to change this to, a vertical format or wider or a square or whatever I want, I have the ability to do that. I can just type in, whatever value I want here, 5,000, let's say, and you'll see it gets as big and it's going to recenter the character there. So I could do whatever I want with that. I'm going to undo that. I can also change the frame rate. So right now it's at 24 frames per second, which is a pretty typical animation frame rate. If I wanted to be a little bit more choppy, I could change it to 12 frames per second. This is more like what you might find in like a stop motion style video. So if you're going for that look, you could do that. But I can make this 60 if I wanted to, and then I'm running at a full 60 frames per second. And I've seen a lot more animators on social media and YouTube using the 60 FPS look, and it's a really nice, smooth look as well. So you've got a ton of options here. Do what works for you. But honestly, none of this is affecting the character itself. This is just the scene. So anything I do here is not going to be saved as part of the puppet. It's only going to be saved as this instance of the puppet in this scene right here. Well, with my current settings of 1920 by 1080, a pretty typical HD setup, my character's head is going off the screen and the legs are down below as well. I want to reposition my character, and the way I would do that is select my character down here in the timeline. You can use this later for recording performance, but I'm just going to select the character here. And then by default, one thing over here, we call these behaviors. These are kind of the rules of the character. We'll get into them a little bit later. Transform is showing me all this different information. So if I wanted to scale my character up and down, I could do that by dragging over scale. I can drag over the position, X and Y. I can rotate my character, all of that stuff, whatever I want, change the opacity of it. All of those things. If I want to reset back to the defaults, just click the X next to any value that you've changed, and it'll go back to whatever the default was. So to fit this character a little bit better, I'm going to scale him down a little bit like that, and maybe I position him just slightly down, and that looks pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with how this puppet is looking right now. But I still have that issue of the arms coming off. So let's go see if I can fix that back in rig mode. So I'm going to go ahead and click on rig again. So in basic terms, what's happening here is the arm thinks that this is where it's pivoting from. This is its origin point. So the arm thinks that it's going to rotate from around where the elbow is. And by default, the origin is always going to go in the middle of whatever artwork you have. So that makes sense. And then it thinks that it's connected to whatever is moving around and controlling it. In this case, that's the body up here. And you'll see the body's origin is right here. So this little dotted line circle is the origin of the character. So check this out. If I move the origin, I'm just using the selection tool right down here, this little arrow, to move this body around. If I move it up here and now go to my arm, well, look, the arm thinks it's now connected to here. But instead, I want the arm to actually pivot from the shoulder, right? That's where arms normally move and pivot from when they're rotating around or waving or moving or swinging or whatever. So what I'm going to do is take the origin of the right arm and drag it until it intersects with the rest of the character. And notice as soon as I do that, the character turns green. And it's saying this is a valid connection point, basically. And when I let go, now this arm is basically connected to this character. The reason this is showing up is because it has a independent crown next to it. And you'll notice these crowns are only showing up for the layers that we added the plus to in our Illustrator file. And so that is the secret code that you add to a layer to add a crown next to it. Now, you don't have to do this. I can add a crown to any group or layer that I want. It's not a big deal, but it just makes your life a little bit easier when you're thinking about structuring your puppet, which parts you want to be independent. I'm going to talk about independence a little bit later and illustrate it in a better way. Right now, just trust me, we want this to be independent. Okay, so let's do the exact same thing for the left arm. So I've got my left arm here. I want to drag the origin until it connects to the character, and we'll do it like that. Okay, let's go back to record mode. And now I've solved most of my major problems, right? The character is moving around as I would expect. The head isn't coming off, the body isn't rotating, and the arms are staying stuck to the torso. So with just those few steps, just moving two origins and adding two fixed handles, I've now set up my character to work pretty well. But this is going to be a pretty boring character if this is all it can do, is just move its head around, and that's it. I want to add the ability to move the arms around a little bit, right? And drag them around and have them wave, have them stay on the hips, all of that stuff. When I talk, I use my arms a lot. I want my character to be able to do the same. Let's go into rig mode and rig the arms for movement. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and select my right arm group here. And I'm going to go down to my tools and select this one that looks like a little compass. This is the dragger tool. And with that selected, and with my arms selected, I'm going to go down to where the hands would normally be and just click right there. And that's going to add a draggable tagged handle. So just like we did at the fixed handle, this is a shortcut to make something draggable. And I can do the same thing with the left arm. Let's do it the other way, where I would just select the handle tool, put it here, and tag it as draggable. So that is also tagged as draggable. And if I click the mouse wheel, I can click and drag to move around and see this a little bit better. You can also use the pan tool down here to do the same thing. You also have zoom controls, as well as the selection tool that I've been using and a zoom tool here. All right, so now I've added 2 more handles. Let's go back to record mode. And now my character basically looks the same, but there's one difference. If I click and drag around a hand, I'm going to get some movement. And now I can drag the character and pose it however I want, and it's going to follow my mouse movements. Okay, so that's a great step forward, but these arms are not looking that great. They kind of look like spaghetti. And I want them to be have a little bit more structure, right? We've got bones, we've got our forearm, our bicep here. I want to give my character a little bit more structure. So let's jump back into rig mode. And there's yet another tool down here. Now, this is a unique tool. This is one that you can't use one of these others and just tag it. You actually have to use this. And it's called the stick tool. Sticks are basically just a way to make your character's parts a little bit more rigid. So imagine this is like just a sheet of paper, and you are adding toothpicks to tell where it can and can't bend. So what I'm going to do is drag and kind of create these bones for where the bicep and the forearm would be. So with my arm group selected, I'm going to click and drag and make a stick that goes right about to the elbow. I'm going to stop and leave a little room for the elbow bend, and then click and drag again and make my forearm stick. Let's do the same thing for the right arm. Click and drag, leave a gap, and click and drag. All right, so now let's go to record mode and see how that looks. So now when I drag my arms, you'll see I actually get a realistic bend where that elbow would be. And this is looking significantly better than what I had previously. So this is already a good start. Now notice that the arm where the shoulder is connected, there's a little bit of a bending there, you see, and depending on if you put your arm in front or behind your torso, you can kind of hide that effect, or you're going to see it a little bit more prominently. You could be okay with that. It's fine if you like how it looks, but you also have another option of how things attach to each other. So yet again, let's jump back into rig mode. And if I select my arm, there's a bunch of different options over here, but the one I want to care about right now is attach style. And by default, when you attach something, that is when this origin intersects over something else, you're going to get, let me select my arm again, you're going to get weld as the default. But I also have a few different options. Free is just going to be completely free, and that's not what I want, because now when I drag it, it's going to completely come off. If you have a robot that like shoots an arm off, that's great, but for 99% of the characters, that's not what you want. So let's not do that, but you could try hinge mode instead. Hinge mode is more like a helicopter blade, right? It's going to kind of move around and pivot and rotate like it's like a propeller blade instead. And so you don't get the bend here like you would get with the weld. It's a personal preference thing, and depending on your character, one might work better than the other. So play around with it and see what works best for you and your artwork. So now I've got a really basic setup. I can move my head around. I can pose my arms. They've got good elbow bends there. This is kind of the basic skeleton of my character. So now let's start building and adding on top of this basic structure. And let's start with the face. I'm going to start with the eyes and the eyebrows to give it a little bit of extra emotion and movement. The eyes are one of the most important parts of a character, and we want to make sure that they're as expressive as possible. And we also want them to follow our own pupil movements in the webcam. So let's go back into the Illustrator file, and you might have that open still, but in case you don't, or you forgot where you saved it or whatever, you can always select your puppet up here. And when you do that in the project panel, you'll see there's a little symbol that appears here. If this is an AI file, the Illustrator icon is going to show up. It's a Photoshop file, PSD file, the PS Photoshop icon is going to show up. So if I have this guy selected and I click AI, that is going to open up that original file that it's looking at and referencing. All right, so I'm going to zoom into my head here. I'm going to use Option on Mac or Alt on PC and my scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom in a little bit here. And then I'm going to click my mouse wheel and do something like that to recenter it like that. You can also use the space bar and left click to do that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and add my first eye. So I'm going to select my BG layer that's inside my head and add a new layer that goes on top of it. And let's just use, again, a simple circle. ellipse tool, and white and black looks pretty good to me. I do want this to be a white pupil with a black outline. And I'm just going to click and drag and make something like that. Looks pretty good. Now, it looks like it forgot my stroke, how big that was. So I'm going to go back to my properties here and click the stroke until it has a similar line weight. It doesn't have to be the exact same, but let's say something like 10 looks pretty good to me. Now, inside that eye, I want a pupil. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer that's going to be over top of that, still on the ellipse tool. And I'm going to click and drag and make a pupil like that. Now, for my character's pupil, I actually don't want a stroke. So I'm going to click the stroke and then click this little none symbol down here, which is going to remove the stroke. And instead, I can just double click and then make this pupil whatever color I want. I'm just going to make it black so it's really easy for us to see. But of course, you could do it whatever color you want. Now, in general, you want your pupil to be smaller than your eyeball, right? So I don't want my pupil to be so big like this because then the way that this works is that the pupil is going to move around inside the eyeball. And if I make it too big, it's not going to have enough room to move around in. It's going to kind of bump up against the edges. There's some ways around that with clipping masks and some other techniques that we can talk about later. But for now, let's just keep it really simple and keep it right in the middle of this circle here. So inside my head now, I have my background, I have this eyeball layer, and I have this pupil layer as well. I want to do one more thing for this eye, and that is add a blink state. So when my character blinks, I want to show what that looks like. And I can make it as simple as just a really simple line. So what I'm going to do is add one more layer here and go to the rectangle tool. And I'm just going to click and drag like this right across the middle of both of my circles, something like that. And so what's going to happen is if I turn off the visibility for my eyeball and my pupil, this is what it's going to look like when the character blinks. It's going to hide both of these two things and show that instead. For the time being, I can turn this off so it doesn't look weird. Whoops, this line, and there we go. Okay, so I've got three different layers, the eyeball, the pupil, and the blink, and I want to put them all inside an eye container. So I'm going to create one more layer here. This would be a group in Photoshop. And I'm just going to double click and we're going to call this plus right eye because again, this is on the character's right side of the face. And then I'm going to shift select these three things, these three elements and drag them into my right eye. So now I have this group, the right eye, that is going to have all three of these things inside of it. So these things need very particular names for Character Animator to do the auto tagging for them and tell them exactly what these things should be doing. If I just call this, white and, middle and just blink, these aren't going to work because Character Animator doesn't know what these are. It doesn't know that middle is a pupil and it should track your own pupil movements. So I can make my life a little bit easier by calling this right eyeball, this one plus right pupil. And let me move this out a little bit so you can see a little bit better. There we go. And this one, right blink. So when I bring these in, Character Animator is going to understand, okay, the eyeball, that's the bounding box basically of where the pupil can go. The pupil, it's independent, it's going to move on its own, and it's the thing that's going to show up in the middle. And the right blink is going to show up whenever I blink my eyes in the webcam. So let's go ahead and save this character. You don't want to save as, you don't want to save a copy. You need to save over the reference file that you've already, Character Animator is already connected to. And let's bring this Cyclops character into Character Animator and see what happens. So already I can see that I have a working eye. It's just one eye, but it's already working well. So I can see as I move around with my pupils and as I blink, the character is doing exactly that. So this immediately feels like it already has a little bit more life, right? We had this lifeless blue character without any facial features, but now I've got this nice eye staring back at me, and the character already feels a little bit more friendly and approachable and interesting. Let's give him another eye and see what happens. So let's go back to the Illustrator file. Okay, so I probably want my left eye to look exactly the same as my right eye. So I'm going to turn the blink on temporarily here, just so all the contents are visible and I make sure that I'm copying everything over because you would hate to copy just the pupil and eyeball over, but you forget the blink. And then I'm going to select this eye group here, and I'm going to hold down Option on Mac or Alt on PC and click and drag and move it so the line is above the right eye or below, it really doesn't matter, and let go. And that's going to make a copy of it. So again, I selected my group here. I held down Option on Mac or Alt on PC, click and drag above, and now I've got a copy. I'm going to press Shift and the right arrow just to move it over a little bit, and then let go of Shift and do some more fine tuning like that. And now I've got my copied eye that's looking pretty good. Now we don't want to leave this called right eye copy. Let's double click this, delete the copy part, and we're going to call this left eye like that. And let's twirl it open. And we also want to change the same thing here where I call this left blink. Basically, we're getting rid of all the copies and we are changing all the directions to left instead of right. And at this point, I can turn those blinks back off so I can see my eyes a little bit better. So before we go back to Character Animator, let's do one more thing. Let's add some eyebrows to my character as well. So I'm going to select whatever eye is on top here and click the plus button down here to add one more new layer. And I'm just going to create a rectangle above one of the eyes. Let's just do it like this. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to put it a little bit over here. And I'm going to rename this to plus right eyebrow. Okay, and now to make my left eyebrow, I'm going to select this, copy it, edit copy, make a new layer, paste it in, edit paste, and bring that up here so it's aligned with the other eyebrow. And we're going to name this one plus left eyebrow. Okay, before we go back to Character Animator, just take a look and make sure everything's spelled correctly and is working the right way. So I see my plus left eyebrow, plus right eyebrow, plus left eye with left blink, plus left pupil and left eyeball inside, and plus right eye, right blink, plus right pupil and right eyeball inside. If all of this looks good, all of these are named correctly, then you're good to go. Let's save and let's move back to Character Animator. All right, so now I've got a character that is staring back right at me and it's blinking, it's moving around with the eyes, and the eyebrows are also moving up and down as well. To make sure your movement is calibrated with your character, you want to look at your character in the webcam, center yourself, and then click this little calibrate button here, and that's going to kind of recenter the character. So if I wanted to start from over here, for example, I click calibrate, and now that's my new center position. Or if I want to do this, and this is where I want to start from, click calibrate. It's just a simple thing to make sure you're getting the right results for your character. Now, even at this early stage, I have some control over how much my character is moving based on my own movements in the webcam. So let's start with eye gaze, for example. I'm going to twirl this open down here. These are our behaviors. These are our rules for how our character should animate. And eye gaze is going to control how the eyes move, right? So I noticed that camera strength is set to 100% by default. That means when my pupils are moving, the pupils for the character are going to move 100% of the way to the edges of the eyeball. Now, in this case, I might want him not to move all the way. So let's try changing this to something like 50%. And now look what's happening. The pupils are still moving, but they're not going all the way to the edges of the eyeball. So you can kind of fine tune that performance as much as you want, to have it move as much as you want or as little as you want. Now I could of course make this really big, and then the pupils are going to come completely out of the eyes, and nobody wants that. So let's change it back. Here are a few other options. Snap eye gaze. This is going to mean the eyes are going to snap either in the center or up, down, left, right, or diagonal. If I turn this off, the eyes are going to be a little bit more jittery and try to move with my pupils in a more one-to-one fashion. This is not typically how 2D animation looks and how pupils move around. So snap eye gaze is by default, but it just shows you have an option there. Same with minimum snap duration. This means every 1 second, it's going to check and see if the pupils are in a new position. But if that feels too slow or too fast, you can actually change this to be, whatever you want. And I can even do half a second if I wanted to as well, 0.5. So that's going to make the pupils move a lot more. Again, if I want to switch any of these back to their defaults, I just click the little X there, and that's going to change it back to whatever I started out with. Okay, so let's twirl that up and move into face. Now I've got more control over the face as well. And one of the biggest ones you're going to fool around with is head position strength. Actually, head position strength and head tilt strength are two big ones that I almost always change for a character. So head position is going to change how much the character's head moves with your own head movements. So I move this up to 224%, and then it's moving quite a lot. It was at 100%. If I move this even smaller, let's say 50%, now the head isn't going to move left and right, up and down as much for this character. So I've got full control over that. Same thing with tilt strength. So I've got 75% here. If I turn this way up, then the character is going to do all sorts of crazy gymnastics to move around. And I like that amount to tilt at just 75, but I can make it more subtle if I wanted to have not as much tilt back and forth for the character. One parameter I almost always change is this one here, head scale strength. This is set to 25% by default. And that just means as I get closer or further away from the camera, the head is going to change its shape as well. So if I change this to really high up, you can get a really inflated head like that, or a really small one. To me, this typically doesn't look good unless you're like a floating character, like a bird or something that you want to fly in and out and closer to the screen, or a ghost. So for me, I'm going to leave this at 0. And honestly, for 99% of my characters, I set this to 0, and that's how it is. I also have eyebrow strength. So how much are my eyebrows moving up and down? This is set to 75% by default, but if I want it to be higher or lower, I can do that as well to get some extra expressiveness. And I can also change what tilt, how far I'm going to allow my eyebrows to tilt up and down. So if I want a really like surprised character, maybe I'm going to, let's set the eyebrow strength back to 75, but let's change the raised eyebrow strength to not 20%, but like 66%. And now it's going to pivot up more. And I can keep going, as high as I want until it like flips around, and that's not going to look good. But you get the idea. You have control over how angry or how surprised your character can be through your own eyebrow movements. Move eyebrows together is a fun one because if you uncheck this, now your eyebrows are going to move independently. And if you're really good with eyebrow, control, which I'm not that great at, but you can kind of see how I'm kind of doing like a confused look right here. The eyebrows are moving one at a time. So you do have that as an option. Typically, I feel like this can look a little more jittery if you have this turned on by default. So I typically have it turned on, but sometimes if I'm doing something live or having fun with it, I'll turn it off. So this is a general rule about all these behaviors. There is no one right answer to what these numbers are. We give you our best guess as a default. Hey, maybe the head position strength should be 100, head scale should be 25. But it is totally up to you and your character and your artwork what all of these parameters are. So with any character I make, I go through all of these behaviors and try different things and see what works. And you can just experiment and have fun because remember, you can always just click the X to reset back to the original values. So there's really no harm. You're not hurting your original puppet file. You're just playing around with this instance of the puppet in this scene. So our puppet's looking pretty good so far. The eyes are being very expressive. I've done the details and the head movements to exactly what I want. But now we want our character to talk. We probably want to fill in the rest of the face. So let's add a nose and mouth, and let's go back to our original Illustrator file. So again, the way I'm going to do that is select my blue guy puppet over here and click the AI icon. All right, so making a nose is really easy. I'm just going to make a new layer, and I'm going to make sure this layer is inside my head group. And I want to make sure it's not like inside my eye group or anything like that, because then when I blink, it's actually going to make my nose disappear. So you never want things in your eye group that don't belong there. So keep your eyes, groups twirled up like that, and it should be a little easier to move around. But otherwise, up here is fine. And I'm just going to name this plus nose. And then it's automatically going to be added and tagged as a independent nose. Now, this is not 100% critical. The nose isn't used in that many behaviors. It's used for a little bit of parallax and things like that. So you could call this whatever you want, honestly, but just to give yourself the most flexibility later on, I would call this plus nose. And then you can make this, whatever you want. You could, use your shapes again and make a rectangle, an ellipse, whatever you want, polygon. For this, I'm actually going to use the pin tool up here, which is a really common tool that I use all the time for Illustrator artwork in particular, which is just going to allow me to click and make a freehand shape. So I'm just going to make a quick triangle this way by clicking and then clicking down here, click again, and click one more time to close the shape. And now I've got a nose shape that's appearing in my plus nose layer. I probably want this to be a different color inside, so I'm going to select it and probably go with like an orange or some other complementary color to the blue. So maybe something like that. And then let's move this in over here. I don't want him to have a duck beak, so I'm going to make that a little bit smaller and do something like that. And there you have it. There's your nose. So now we're ready to move on to what I think is the most complicated part of rigging a puppet, and that's the mouth shape. So I'm going to show you the hard way to do it, and then I'm going to show you an easier way to do it. So let's start with the hard way. If I was rigging this from scratch, the way I would do it is basically create a bunch of new layers, and I'm going to put everything in a plus mouth group, and then I'll just start to put these layers inside here. And the very first mouth I want is neutral. I'm going to tag it, call it neutral. So both of these are going to get automatically tagged when they come into Character Animator, the mouth and neutral. So this is what I want my character to show up when they are not speaking, whatever their basic default mouth should look like. So I'm just going to make a really simple, I'm going to use the line tool over here, line segment tool, and I'm just going to click and drag like that. And that is my neutral mouth. So if my character isn't talking, isn't saying anything, that's what's going to show up. I might move it a little bit further up like that. So now I'm going to work on a more open mouth shape. So I'm actually going to take this neutral and lock it and use that kind of as a guide for my other mouths. So I'm going to select this next layer below it, and I'm just going to click again with the pen tool across like this and maybe make it open like this. Something very simple like that. And then let's also take the color and make it filled inside. Okay. So now if I go over here, I can see that's my neutral mouth and that's my open mouth. Now I know from using Character Animator for several years now that I would want this to be called AA. And then that's automatically going to get tagged as an ah mouth. And then let's just make one more here. So I'm actually going to hide this A mouth here. And I'm just going to do one more. And I'm going to call this O, OH. And I'm going to make in here just a really simple circle, using the ellipse tool and going right around where the center is, or a little bit to the side so I have some room to move around. And we'll make this the O mouth like this. Okay, so now if he was saying O, that's what his mouth would look like. If he was neutral, he'd be like that. And if he's saying ah, he'd go like that. So with just these three mouths, let's save this and bring it into Character Animator and see what happens. Okay, so what I notice is if my blue microphone icon is on over here and I'm seeing a green signal show up, then when I say certain words, this character is going to react to them. Now, it's not doing a lot right now because I haven't filled in all the mouth shapes, but if I say like, okay, you'll notice that it's showing me the two mouths, right? Okay. And so it knows those are the particular symbols that it's looking for. So if I go to rig mode and I select any group or layer, let's just select my mouth group right now. And I can see over here, this has automatically been tagged as a mouth, just like I want. I'll notice on the right-hand side here, these are all the possible mouth shapes I could create. So right now, let's twirl up in this mouth. I only have neutral, which gets illuminated over here, ah, which gets illuminated here, and O, down here. But I could also draw and add all these additional mouth shapes as well. An M shape for sounds, or S, or D, or E, or or R, W, F, L. So all of these I can do, however I want. And there's some basic guides for, if you look at the icons here, of what these mouth shapes might traditionally look like. So an S or a D sound is more clenched teeth looking. The M is very similar to neutral. Usually it's drawn a little bit smaller and puckered in a little bit. And then these O and R and W are kind of these rounded ones. And then F and L are more kind of in between ones that they kind of show up usually in small bursts before they're not, typically held. They're kind of used to transition between some of these other visemes. But F is more shown as like a biting lip here, or biting the top of the lip. And L has kind of a curved tongue against the teeth. So I could draw all of these and name them appropriately. So I could, in my original Illustrator file, also add inside my mouth group another layer called M, and another layer called S, and another called D, and so on and so forth. And eventually, you would have your full complete mouth set, and you can make it look exactly like you want. So if your character has fangs, the way that shows up, or the way their tongue moves, or whatever, sort of special treatment you want to give to your character, you can use this as a guide and make whatever you want. I should note that there are two additional mouth shapes down here called Smile and Surprised, and these basically are like neutral. These will show up only if nothing is being said, but they'll also only show up if you're doing this in the webcam. So if I smile in the webcam and I have something in my mouth group tagged as smile, then that is the mouth that's going to show up as long as I'm not saying anything. Same with surprised. If I then open my mouth in the webcam and nothing's being said, it will show this. Personally, I don't use these that much because I find I will accidentally trigger them a lot when I don't mean to, and it can lead to kind of inconsistent results. So instead, I will do triggered mouths, which we can talk about a little bit later. So I personally leave these off, but these are an option if you want to add some additional expressiveness to your live character. So if you want to do that sort of thing, you can absolutely take the time to do it. But for me, I started out not knowing how to do this stuff at all. And the way I started with mouth shapes was taking a mouth set from a different character or from a mouth template Photoshop or Illustrator file, and then bringing it into my character. And then I used that as a starting point that I could manipulate to fit my character or the style a little bit more. So if the teeth, I wanted to do a little bit something different to that, or the color of the tongue wasn't in the same palette of my character, I could make small modifications here and there to have it fit my character's style a little bit more. But honestly, I think if you are just starting out, taking a mouth from another character is probably the best place to start. So I'm going to go back to the home screen here in Character Animator, and I'm just going to click on, there's this character Chad right here. This is a really, really simple character for Photoshop and Illustrator versions. So if you were using Photoshop, I would click on Photoshop, but for me, I'm using Illustrator, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the text that says Chad Illustrator. And what that's going to do is give me this disembodied head character called Chad, who is just a really simple face, but notice he's got a full mouth set that's moving with every single syllable and thing I say. So I'm going to take his mouth set out of his file and add it to my own character. So you'll notice the project panel got a little more crowded now because now I don't just have my blue guy puppet in scene, but I have my Chad puppet in scene as well. So if I select my Chad puppet here and then click on the AI icon, so now I've got my original Chad artwork here, and I can see that if I twirl open his mouth group, he has a mouth for every single one of these shapes, including smile and surprised at the bottom here. So what I can do is first let's go back to my blue guy, and I'm just going to get rid of this mouth that I was playing around with. I don't need that anymore, so I just selected it and pressed the trash can down here to delete it. And now I'm going to go back to Chad, and the way you do this in Illustrator, it's way easier in Photoshop. You can actually just take this group that the mouth is in and just drag it into your tab up here. If you have two tabbed comps, and it's just going to show up, and then you can just click and drop it wherever you want. Whatever reason, you can't do that in Illustrator yet. So the way you would do that in Illustrator is with this mouth selected, I want to turn the visibility on for all of these mouths. So it's going to look a little weird right now, but trust me, this is going to make sense. This is how we want to bring it over. And then I'm going to select this little circle that appears next to my mouth group over here. I'm going to select that. And you'll notice what that does is it's going to select every mouth shape that this character has. So all the things in the mouth over here. And then I'm going to go to Edit, Copy. So now I've copied all those mouths in that group. So once that's copied, I can go over to my blue guy, and I want to make sure the head group is selected here. I want it to go inside the head, and then Edit, Paste. And you'll see that has now added a plus mouth group with all of these different shapes inside. So I am probably not going to have the right sizing, right? This mouth is way too big for this character. So I'm just going to hold on the corner. I'm going to hold down Shift while I drag to make sure it's going proportionally correctly and it's not bending or warping in any way. And we'll do something like this. Looks pretty good. And then once it's all in now, I can turn off the visibility for all those additional mouths that I don't care about. And now I have a very basic mouth. So here's the cool thing is you can do this with any character. So I showed you with this Chad character, but if you find another character animator character that you really like the way their mouth looks, you can do the exact same thing I just showed to them. As long as their mouth doesn't have, sometimes they also include skin tones, or some of them have like a beard that they might attach to the mouth to have it move around. But I would say 90% of the puppets out there are going to have their own kind of isolated mouth set. And so you can do what I just did. I find the mouth, I select it, I turn everything on, copy it, and then paste it into your thing. And, I might make some adjustments here. This stroke, for example, on this mouth is a little thinner than the stroke that I'm using elsewhere. So I might play around with it and make some refinements of my own. But overall, I really like how this is looking, and this saved me a ton of time. If I had tried to make all of these mouth shapes, I think there's 14 of them here, from scratch, that would have taken me, at least a couple of hours, and it wouldn't have looked as good because I don't know what I'm doing with basic lip sync. So I think this is a great place to start, and this is where I always recommend, particularly for beginner users, to start with the mouth. So with all that being said, let us save this and go back to Character Animator. So now when I talk, my character is actually going to look like it's talking back to me. And that looks really nice. This is looking a lot more responsive already than those terrible, 2 or 3 mouths that I was trying to draw by myself. So this is working really well. Now there's one special thing about Chad's mouth set, and you might see this with other characters, so I'm going to walk through it here as well. Let's go to rig mode and look at the mouths. In particular, there's 3 mouths here that seem to have multiple parts to them, multiple frames to them, and that is and woo. Well, the way that this works basically is the mouth. Let me turn off neutral and just show you and let's zoom in a little bit here. The mouth actually has 2 frames to it. See, there's this and it goes 1, and then it drops down a little bit, 2. So this is actually, the artist who originally created these made a little frame by frame animation and says, anytime you say an mouth shape, I want it to start here and then open up slightly to give it a little bit of extra fluidity. So it's not just swapping out static artwork, it's adding a little bit of frame by frame animation into the mix. And this is something in Character Animator we call cycle layers. So what I'm going to do is with my mouth, I could turn that off and now have my neutral only showing. But with my mouth selected, I'm going to go down here, and on the bottom on the right here, it says behaviors. And I can actually add a behavior to any group or layer that I want to here. So in this case, I've got my mouth selected, and then I click the plus down here, and I can select and add a new behavior to it. In this case, the behavior I want to add is cycle layers. So I'm going to select that. And cycle layers is going to do exactly what it's saying here. It wants to cycle between different layers. It's going to move between the different layers here. So this only has 2 frames. So this is the simplest possible cycle layers we have. But what do I want to happen? Well, when it's triggered, yes, when someone starts speaking and says the shape, this is what I want to appear. Top to bottom. In this case, it is dropping correctly 1 and 2, but if I had accidentally done it the wrong way or the artist did it separately, I could do bottom to top to make sure it's triggering the right way. Advance every 1 frame. This is typically going to look the best, but if you want it to be a little chunkier, I could do 2, 3, whatever I want to make that a little bit shorter. But Vizim's mouth shapes just move so fast that you probably want to keep this to a low number. I do want this to only cycle once, so that's fine, but I could make it continuously if I had something I wanted to like loop over and over again, basically. And I do want it, in the case of mouths, I think it looks best to hold on the last layer. That's just going to let it, if I held that A sound, it's going to stay there as opposed to trying to switch or go back to whatever the next mouth is. And these other parameters I can just leave like they are. Okay, so that was for the shape, but this is also true of and woo. So what I can do is actually select this and see this column where this little brick shows up? That means that the shape now has a behavior associated with it. And if I select this, I can see, yes, if I scroll down, here's the behavior. So now I can do the same thing. Let's select and I'm going to do a shortcut. Instead of going down here to press the plus button, I'm going to go over here and press the plus that appears in the behavior column. And I'm just going to add cycle layers this way. And let's do the exact same thing. When trigger top to bottom, once is good. And I'm just going to select, click, hold on last layer. And I'll do the same for woo. Let's do a plus here, cycle layers, go down here, make sure it's hold on last layer. Okay, let's go back to record mode and see if this looks any better. So it's a pretty subtle thing to see, but as I'm talking, did you see that? How it kind of drops down just a little bit? Ooh, woo. It's the woo mouth, for example, is showing multiple frames of the O moving, and then the is dropping that jaw. Same with the sound is also dropping the jaw. Very subtle, but it is nice because the mouth, it just adds a little bit of additional fluidity to the mouth shape. So if you can find places to add this sort of thing in, if you're making custom mouth shapes, I think it is totally worth it because it's really going to add to that believability of the lip sync. So I feel like with the additions to the face, I've got a much more believable character right now, right? Now the eyes and the mouth and the eyebrows and all that tracking, it's adding a lot more personality to this character already. So let's take a second to dig into that concept of independence that I've talked a lot about before. Remember, that's the little crown icon that is appearing on different things in rig mode. So let's try turning independence off on a few things and see what happens. So back in rig mode, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to turn the left eyebrow independence off. I'm going to toggle that off by selecting it and clicking the crown icon. And then for the right arm, I'm going to remove independence from that as well. So these seem like why would this hurt anything? Why should these things move on their own? They're connected to the body. It really doesn't make sense. Well, let's see what happens. Okay, so immediately I notice that as I'm moving my eyebrow, notice that the whole head is kind of moving up and down. And that is because the eyebrow is not independent, because I didn't say it needs to move on its own, it is actually pulling the rest of the head with its motion. Probably not something we want to do, right? And with the arm, so this left arm over here for the character is looking fine. It's doing exactly what I would expect. But the right arm, it's pulling the rest of the character with it. And you get some really weird looks doing this sort of thing. So the basic rule of thumb is anytime your character is bending or warping in weird ways, it is probably an independence issue. It probably means something needs to be independent that is not independent, and that is influencing the motion. So heading back into rig mode, let's fix this by adding independence to the right arm and independence to the left eyebrow. But it is also true that you can kind of overdo your independence, right? So if I made the head independent, for example, up here, so all these things are independent now let's see what happens. Well, now my head is completely separated from the rest of my body because I decided to make it independent and not connected. So again, I'm going to turn that off. This is really easy to just play around with and see if it helps or hurts your character. This is not set in stone. Remember, if you added the plus in the layer name when you first started out the puppet, it's going to automatically add one of these, and that could be a nice, helpful, shortcut to some of this stuff. But ultimately, it's in your control in Character Animator if different elements are independent or not. And another example would be the pupil, right? You don't want the pupil dragging on the rest of the eye. You want it to be able to move on its own. So just think about that as you're creating your character. And if you do run into those situations where things are warping or bending, just go ahead and try adding independence and see if it helps. So while we're on the subject of fixing issues, I've noticed that if I drag the arms, the elbows and everything are looking good, but I do run into some issues. Like, for example, I can drag this as far out as I want. And that doesn't look that great. As cartoon characters, we can kind of exaggerate movements, but if this was not just blue, if this had like a checkered pattern on it, this would look terrible because it's just going to stretch for a really long time. Secondly, I don't have as much control over the elbows as I want. Notice like when I bend in here, I can get into some really weird positions for this character. And I wish the elbow would just automatically bend a little bit more naturally. Well, that's where a concept called inverse kinematics comes in. And this is a really easy fix that we can add to our character to make that limb movement just a little bit more natural and believable. So for inverse kinematics for a Character Animator, let's go and select this top level character up here. And this is where all my main behaviors are stored. These are kind of the ones that you get but for free by default. When you import a puppet, we just automatically add all these behaviors because we think your puppet probably wants to have eyes, probably has a face, probably wants to stay fixed to the ground, have lip sync, have physics, all that stuff. These are just things that we add in for free. But you can always add more, just like we did with the the cycle layers for the mouth shapes, I could do the same thing for additional behaviors for my top level character. So again, with this blue guy selected up here, this is a selectable icon or selectable area of the puppet. I can go ahead and click on the plus and also add in limb IK. So this is going to add a bunch of stuff here to limb IK. We don't have to worry about any of this stuff right now, but what we do need to think about is look at the arm. For limb IK to understand what's happening with this arm, it needs to know some details. It basically needs to know where the shoulder is, where the elbow is, and where the wrist is. And if it has those 3 data points of information, it's going to be able to do those elbow bends and stop the stretching just like we want. So I'm going to start with my draggable handle that I created over here. I'm going to select that, making sure my selection tool is down here, and select the draggable. And in addition to draggable, I'm also going to tag this over here as a right wrist. Okay? And then I want to show where the elbow is. So remember, to do that, I need another invisible data point. So I'm going to go down to my handle tool down here, and I'm going to click right in between my 2 sticks, and I'm going to tag that as the right elbow. And then the last thing I'm going to do, typically for limb IK, we actually say to do this on the body group instead of the arm itself. And that just helps prevent some issues a little bit later on. So if I go to the body group, I can actually see this green dot showing up where the arm has connected to the body. Because remember, when I started my right arm, I moved where I wanted this green thing to be. And if I moved it down here, if I selected body, you would see the green dot shows up down here. But in this case, I want it to be attached to right where the shoulder blade would be up there. And now when I select the body, I'm just going to put another handle right there, and I'm going to tag that as the right shoulder. Okay, so in my right arm, I've got right wrist and draggable down here, right elbow in the middle, and then on the body group, I have right shoulder tagged here. Let's do the same thing for the left arm. This should go a little quicker. So I see my wrist is already draggable over here. I'm going to also tag it as a left wrist. Then I'm going to add another handle here and tag it as left elbow. And again, go to the body, find where that green attach point dot is, click there, and add the left shoulder. And now when I drag the arm around, notice that it's really hard to get into those weird positions with the arm as I did before. The arm is kind of auto-correcting itself to say where that bend is going to happen. And so this just makes the arm movements a little bit more natural, as well as the stretching. If I try to stretch this, I can't stretch it farther than I want it to go. And so it's going to lead to, again, some more believability for the arms. So limb IK is something I add to every single character that I've ever made since it has been implemented, because it just adds an extra degree of something I don't have to worry about the elbows looking weird or an arm stretching too far. Now you do have some parameters you can play around with here. If I twirl open the limb IK behavior, like the stretchiness, if I want a little more stretchiness, I can set this to, maybe 47%, and then it'll stretch a little bit, but not as much as it would have before. By default, this is set to 10% to give it a little bit of stretch, but if I want 0 stretch, I can set it to 0, and then there's going to be absolutely no arm stretching whatsoever. Another one I really like is elbow flip threshold. So this is going to determine where the elbow transitions from going one way to the other. So let's say I want the elbow to, right around here is where I want it to start going a different way. So I can put my arms in that position and then click and drag over this little dial, and notice that at a certain point, the arms are going to go in a different direction. And now that's going to be my new transition point for when the elbows switch to a different direction. And I can see that a little bit clearer if I do it like this. So play around with it. Again, each character is going to be a little bit different of what parameters you have here, but the default should work pretty well, and then you can kind of build up from there. So jumping back into Illustrator, the last concept that I want to cover with this character is the idea of triggers. Simply put, triggers are just a way to create custom artwork and then decide when you're performing in Character Animator when to show or hide or swap in that artwork at any given time. Now, we've already seen triggers in kind of an automatic fashion with this character, right? For example, the blink states, right? When I blink, it automatically hides the pupil and the eyeball, and it's showing me this blink instead. Same thing with the mouth. When I say certain words, it's going between all these different mouth shapes and triggering the correct mouth. Now, those are more automatic ones that are defined by the webcam or what I'm saying in the microphone, but we can actually create our own custom triggers as well. And then we can bind that to a key or a button so we can press that to automatically change things whenever we want. And that gives us a lot of control and possibility for additional emotion for the character. So let's start with a really simple trigger. I'm just going to have this character have the ability to add glasses to his face if you want. So I'm going to add the new layer button here. I'm going to make sure it's inside the head group, and I'm going to try to put it above everything else because I don't want like the eyes going in front of the glasses. And then I'm going to go over here. I'm actually going to pick the rectangle tool for my frames, and I'm going to do something like this. Now that doesn't look that great right now, so I actually want to select my fill and go to none for that. And then I can select my stroke and do whatever color frame I want. I might do something like similar to the orange of the nose. Let's see how that looks. Something like that. Okay, it doesn't look great, but it's at least showing different from the skin and the rest of the body. And then I'm going to curve this a little bit to give it a frame, a little bit of a rounded corner. And I'm just going to move this over, and then I'm going to copy, and let's paste in place. That's going to put it in the same place. And then I'm just going to use Shift and the arrow keys to move this over and make the frame cover the other eye. And then I'm just going to use the rectangle tool here just to make some, actually, you know what? Let's use the line tool instead. That's going to be better. And I'm just going to click and drag like that and click and drag like that. Okay, so now I've got this goofy looking layer here that is glasses. And I'm just going to call this glasses. Let's save and see what happens in Character Animator. Okay, so yeah, as expected, when I come back to Character Animator, the artwork that I just saved is now showing up on my character's face. But maybe I don't want his glasses on all the time. Maybe he only needs his glasses for reading or for long distance viewing or something like that. And I want him to be able to show or hide those glasses at any time. So let's jump into rig mode. And you'll notice there's this panel down here called triggers. And it says drop layers, replays, or audio here to create triggers. So if I want to create a trigger from these glasses, it's really easy. I just select it and I drag it into this triggers area. And now it shows up as a trigger. So I've got my trigger name here. I've got a little icon that shows that it's a trigger. And then in this little box over here, I can type in any alphanumeric key that I want. So let's just do a G for glasses and press enter. And now this trigger is bound to the G key. Doing this and making this a trigger is suddenly changed everything. Now, these glasses aren't actually going to show up by default. Even though I'm seeing them here and I can turn the visibility on and off, it doesn't matter. As soon as I go back to record mode, these glasses are not going to show up by default. Now they are only going to show up when I trigger them, which is going to be with the G key here. So yeah, the glasses are gone. And now if I press the G key on my keyboard, they are showing up. And as soon as I let go, they go away. I have some additional options down here. If I had a MIDI hookup, I could actually hook this up to a specific MIDI note to play and trigger. I can also set it to latch, and this is going to make it more like a light switch, basically. I don't have to hold down the G key if latch is checked. It means I just have to press it once and let go, and then it's going to stay in place until I click it again. I use latch a lot in my puppets. I personally find it a little bit easier to use and not have to, do these finger gymnastics to hold down multiple triggers at once. But it's a personal preference. There's no right or wrong way to do it. You can play around with it and see what works best for you. And then down here, this is showing where the artwork is, what is being triggered exactly. So if I rename this to something else and I forget where it came from, I can see the path down here. And if I click on this, it's going to highlight the correct artwork up here. So even if I had something else selected, if I click this, it's going to add glasses. Now, I can actually drag a lot of different things into here. So let's say I also, for some reason, wanted the arms to be triggered by the exact same trigger. So I could drag these in, drag it over top of my trigger, and now look, the left arm and right arm are showing up as part of my layers and replays. So if I went back to record mode, now the glasses and the arms are all missing. But if I press G, they all come back and show up. So a trigger can show and trigger multiple things at once, which is great for a character where you might want multiple things to change for their expression. Maybe their mouth and eyes and hand positions and other things all change at once to make a particular emotion come across. But this is a completely useless trigger with the arms. I don't know why I would use that. So I'm just going to click the X down here to remove those two instances. And now it's only going to be for the glasses. So back in Illustrator, I'm just going to hide the glasses for now so I don't have to see them. I usually like keeping my character in its default state without triggers, so I kind of have an idea of what it's going to look like at first. But let's move on to a different situation where you may want to swap in different artwork at any given time, not just have something disappear or reappear, but to have one thing and then swap in something else to replace it. A really common example of this is a hand position, right? So let's go ahead and I'm just going to select my right arm here, and I'm going to click the new layer button like 4 times. And I'm going to call one of these, double click and call it hands. And I'm going to call one default, one flip, and one point. And I'm going to shift select these 3 and put them inside hands. So now my hand group or container here has default, flip, and point. I'm going to drag the hands into the right arm. So now I've got inside my body, I've got my plus right arm, and inside that right arm, I've got this artwork, which is right now just called rectangle here. And then I've got this blank container that's got default, flip, and point in it. So let's start with default. So to make the hand, I'm going to use the pen tool again up here. This is the easiest way for me to make a quick freeform shape. So I'm going to make sure default is selected over here. And I'm just going to click in this blank space and make something like this, where I've got a thumb, and then I click and drag like that, and we'll come back down like that. And there is a really basic hand. Now I can modify this however I want. If I didn't like, for example, how much this is coming in like this, I could do a window stroke, and I'm going to go to show options to see everything. And then I have some different ideas of if I want rounded corners or how these things connect. So you can play around with that with the pen tool. I'll quite often play around with these and see what works best for the character. But that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to rotate it down like this and try to connect it and have it line up as best I can. I might have to resize it a little bit, and it's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to get it close enough that I feel it looks okay. Okay, so there's this guy's basic default hand. So let's really quickly make a variation of this where I'm just going to have the thumb flip to the other side, basically. So I'm just going to select this, go to Edit, Copy, go on my flip layer right here, and go to, let's see, select flip and go to edit paste. And now this is going to show up in my flip layer, but it's the exact same way. I want it to actually go the other way. So I'm just going to manually drag it like that. And I'm just going to try to line it up as best I can. Now my default's getting in the way, so I'm going to turn off the visibility of that for now and do something like that. Okay, so now I've got my flipped variation, I've got my default variation, and now I want to also do a point. So I'm just going to take this, I'm going to take the pen tool, I'm going to try to do it here, but I also don't want to interfere with this artwork I've already have with the rectangle. So I'm actually going to select this rectangle and lock it. And that's going to not have me accidentally interfere with that. And then I'll select my point, and I'm just going to make a really basic, point type thing. So let's just make a thumb like this, and then it comes out to a point like this, and then we'll have it go in like that, something like that to be my point view. Okay, so now we've got these 3 different states: default, flip, and point. But I only am going to want one of these to show up at a time, right? I don't want them to always look like this. So let's just keep default on by default. I'm going to unlock rectangle now. And I'm just going to save with this one hand with the arms like this and with the hands like this. And let's see what happens in Character Animator. All right, so it looks like everything's synced up correctly. And in my right arm group, if I dig in here, I should now see hands showing up as well. And in here, I've got default, flip, and point. So what I'm going to do is actually grab this grouping of these 3 different things, hands, I'm going to click and drag that group into this triggers area. But what I want to do is put it over create swap set. Swap set is a special type of trigger that says, all right, you've got a bunch of different things, but I only want to show one at a time. So I'm going to do that. And that creates my swap set. So what this swap set is saying is basically I've got a group called hands here. And in these, default is going to show up first. Whatever icon I have selected here is going to be the one that shows up by default. So if for some reason I want the point to show up first, I could do that and select that. But default is the one that I want, so I'm going to set that. You can also do it by checking down here instead of the icon, but I just use the icon. Okay, so with default set, I don't actually have to put a trigger for it because it's just automatically going to show up. But let's move to flip. This is something that I want to show up at times. So I'm going to set this to 1, and then point, I'm going to set to 2. And then I'm going to shift select both of these and latch them as well. Okay, so what this is saying is default's going to show up, but when I press 1, show the flip artwork and hide the default. And when I show 2, show the point and hide anything else. So let's go back to record mode and see what happens. All right, so I've got my character now with his hand, and this looks good like this. But when I start to wave, it's facing, the thumb's facing the other way. But if I press the 1 key, now it's looking correct, and I've swapped in different artwork. A lot of times in animation, we will hide these things with arm motions. So if I do, like this, and then press 1 as I'm moving up, it kind of hides that swap. Things are moving so fast that you don't see where that transition is happening. So a lot of times, when characters are doing quick arm movements, they'll kind of hide these hand changes in there. And then for the point, that was the 2 key, so I can press that. And now he's got a point as well. So this already adds a lot of additional emotion possibilities to my character. I can, give him a lot more of, a wave type animation or pointing at something or whatever. And by the way, when I already have like point triggered and then I press that trigger again, when I press 2, it's just going to go back to the default state. And so that's how I kind of set up. You could add a trigger key for your default as well. But for me, that's just one more thing that I need to think about. And so I just leave it as the default and let the other keys and triggers do the work. Now, if you're adding a lot of triggers to your character, it can be kind of difficult to remember what does what. Oh yeah, I want him to point. Was that 1 or 2, or did I do P for point? And when you get to really complicated puppets where you're using every single value on the keyboard, how are you going to remember all this stuff? Well, luckily, there's a graphical way to do this in Character Animator. Over here, by default, we don't see the triggers panel by default, although you can tab over to it if you want to. I see controls instead, and I see this button, Generate Controls for Blue Guy. Sounds intriguing. Let's go ahead and click on it and see what happens. So check that out. It automatically made these buttons for me that I can trigger the different triggers with. So if I do this and click on here, instead of the G key, it's going to trigger the glasses. Now I can still press G and it'll still light up and activate, but this is just a more visual and I find fun way to do your different triggers. So now I can see that this one doesn't have a key associated with it. This is my default here. And then I've got my flip and my point as well. So this is great. This is really easy if I'm giving this puppet to someone else to record or sharing it with a friend or other people. This lets them really easily see what all the triggers can do. I even have the ability to add layout options as well. So if I go into layout mode, I can rearrange these however I want. So maybe I actually don't want the default to show up at all. I'll just select it and press delete. And then I can rearrange these. Maybe I want my point to be more important. They kind of snap into place into a grid as you move them around. And that looks pretty good. And then when I go back to perform mode, now I've got my new setup. Now I can see this in rig mode too. If I go to controls, I've got the exact same thing. I can't obviously activate them here because I don't have an active scene showing up, but I can do all my layout stuff as well. One cool little tip and trick that you can do is by default, it's just going to take whatever artwork is visible. And sometimes that works really well, but sometimes you're going to want to make a custom icon. Maybe you want to add words in here or make something. A really cool trick is you can drag anything from here. Like let's say I want the torso to show up instead of the point, and I can drag this artwork into here in layout mode. And now that's going to be the new thing that shows up instead of what's by default. And then I can undo that. And if there's multiple parts of multiple artwork options available, if I right click, I can see those different artwork options show up here. And I can also do a light or a dark background as well if I wanted to do that. So you have a few little custom options here to make this controls panel as customized as you want. And with that, now you have the foundation of a basic character animator puppet. We now know how to have a head and body, how to have the head move around with our own head movements, how to do eyebrows, pupils, blinking, mouth movements, adding cycle layers to certain mouths to make them a little more fluid, as well as being able to drag the arms around and use triggers to get different things to appear. So now that you have this basic foundation, it's kind of up to you where to go from here. You could just take the basics that we learned today and you can make some great character performances, right? And if you use your own artwork for this instead of this weird blue guy, you can make some really great stuff. And if you do this and then the intro to character animator video that kind of shows how the recording process, you're pretty much set on making your own animated content out there. But now that you've kind of scratched the surface, you may be thinking, well, okay, I want to do more. Like, I want my character to walk and move around. I want my character to be able to kick. I want my character to be able to turn the head around and do head turns or parallax movements. I want to be able to trigger more complicated things like animated sequences called replays to make my character do like a flip or a kung fu kick or something like that. Well, luckily, we have a ton of tutorials about all of that stuff. So if you want to dig in deeper to learning more about building on top of this foundation and adding new things to your character, those videos are out there. I've listed some of the most common ones in the video description below, but feel free to search this channel, this OK Samurai channel, for all sorts of different things and just keep adding and learning and building on your character. And that's the great thing. Once you've got a rig for a puppet, you can just keep editing it and building on it and making new things to it and just evolving it over time. And before you know it, you're going to have this really fully featured character with a great range of emotion and the ability to really, make some really compelling animated stories. And as an added bonus, in the video description below, I have a link to a free download of a intro to rigging project that's going to show you a bunch of different body types and common rig setups for characters. It's going to be really simple. So this character, this is the first one. This is front simple. You'll see in the left-hand side here, I've divided this into puppets and scenes. So you can double click on any puppet to go into it in rig mode and see how, everything was tagged by selecting it. And then in the scene, just double click on any one of these and it will show it to you in record mode. So I'll quickly run through these as a preview of what you can expect if you want to dig into any of these and learn more about them. So first, we have just exactly what we just did, making a very simple front-facing character and how I would, do the arms and fixing the feet and basically everything we did for the past hour. Scene 2 is a quarter-facing character. So this is a 3/4 view character. And this is going to be a little more versatile because you can have it feel like it's talking to the audience in the screen or talking to other characters on the side. And so rigging this is very simple. It's very similar to the other one. It's just a matter of where you put the arms and legs. So this one shows up in front of the body and this one shows up behind. Or you could go all the way to the side like scene 3 and do a side character that's going to be a complete profile view. And the same thing where you've got an arm here, but then I also have another arm hidden back here behind the character. And so I can make gestures and motions like that. Scene 4 answers the common question, what if I want my arms to go in front of my face? Because we normally say the head is in the front and the body is underneath it in the layer stack. If you move your arms, they're always going to look like they're going behind your head. Well, in this case, I've rigged the character so the arms can actually go in front of the face. And it's really simple. I just swap the positions. I put the body group first and the head group underneath, and that's all you'd have to do. Scene 5 is a little weird, but sometimes you want to make a character that the head and the body are actually one and the same. So how would you go about doing that? Well, you put all the facial features in the head group. So the head group only is comprised of the eyes and the mouth, and then the body group actually has the background of the head and the limbs attached to it, and it's a pretty simple setup. Scene 6 shows that we're not just limited to two-legged characters, that I could do a four-legged character and fix all those different legs on the ground and still have some pretty good animation and motion. 7 starts to get into a walking character. Basically, the way that we started to rig the arms for limb IK, where we said where the shoulder and elbow and wrist were, you just kind of extend that and you start to also show where the hips are, where the ankles are, where the knees are, where the neck is. And once you add all these different tags and sticks and move the origins around and all of that, and add a walk behavior down here and have a bunch of variations for that, your character is just going to automatically start walking. If you are interested in having your character walk, I highly suggest watching the dedicated walking tutorial, which is going to go into detail about all the walking stuff I'm about to show. So instead of having a character that only walks one way, you could have a character like this. This is a 3-view walk. So this is scene 8 in the project, where I start in a stationary view, but then when I press the left arrow keys, my character starts to walk to the left. If I let go, stops. And then if I press right, it looks like they're moving to the right. And so this is a great way to create a really versatile character that can, move around the scene quite a lot. And finally, even though the walk behavior is modeled for two-legged characters and creatures, you can actually kind of brute force your way into a four-legged character. Look, this character has 2 walk behaviors. So all I really did was have a walk behavior for these front legs and then a walk behavior for these back legs. I tagged them all correctly, and now I've got a 4-legged character. Scene number 10 goes more in depth with the limb IK behavior. So we only focused on the arms for our simple character, but check it out. You can also do the legs as well and have the knees bend in a correct position as well. And what I love about this character is he also has a dragger right here on his neck. So I can kind of drag and do some fun stuff like that. I can even have him jump up in the air and land on the ground like that. Limb IK is super awesome. If you are interested in learning more about it, check out the dedicated Limb IK video. Again, the link is in the video description below. With scene 11, head turn, your face does not always have to be in one position looking forward. You can actually set it up where when you turn your head in the webcam, your character's head is going to move around as well. So all I did was make multiple instances of my head and said, this is my quarter view, my profile view, my front view, and quarter and profile. And if I tag all those and add the head and body turner behavior here, it's going to do that and allow me to move my head around. If you're interested in learning more about this, check out the head turning and parallax tutorial video. But scene 12 shows that you don't just have to limit it to the head. It is called the head and body turner. So as I turn my head, I can actually turn my body as well. And it's very similar to what I did with the head turner. I'm just tagging my different views and putting different instances of them in there and then hooking them up to the head and body turner behavior. Scene 13, advanced head tilt, is a technique that some of our more advanced users are using to give a little bit more extra movement to the head. So normally, as I tilt my head left and right, it's going to move my whole body with it. But now I've got a little bit more independent control of my head, and that allows me to look down, look up, get a little bit of additional rotation to my character. It's a little bit tricky. It involves tagging multiple things as head, making things independent that are not usually independent. It's a little difficult, but if you dig into the puppet, you'll see how it's working and you can do a similar setup. Scene 14 is showing body tracking. So yes, I can hook up my character and say where the wrists are and elbows and all of that, and then have my own webcam movements move the hands around. So this is a very simple example of this character, but I can also do full body tracking with the character as well, if I wanted to. So lots of possibilities here. So if you're interested in learning about body tracking, the link's in the video description below. So go have fun, get started, make your own characters, make your own videos, your own animations, and just have a good time doing it. Now, during the rigging process, you might run into issues. Actually, you will run into issues. Your puppet's head's gonna fall off, an eyeball's gonna pop out of their head, arms aren't gonna be connected. You're like, what's going on? And you're not gonna remember, oh yeah, it was at minute 37 and 27 seconds when he was talking about this one specific detail that I need. So if you do run into problems or forget some of these things, it's okay. The best place to get help is the official Character Animator forums. You can post your puppets there. People will take a look at them, tell you what's wrong, get you the help that you need, or put you in the right direction for a particular video or resource or example that you're looking for. And when you do make a character, we'd love to see it. So please use hashtag Character Animator on social media so we can check out your creations and see what you're up to. But that is it for today. Thanks so much for watching this whole thing and sticking with it. I'm really excited to see what everyone creates with it. And until next time, have fun.